Welcome, everybody. Before we get started with some announcements, we're kind of closing in on the final couple lessons on our pretty detailed study of Ecclesiastes. It'll end up being 11, a series of 11 classes, and we're on number 9. So next week and the week after that will be the final two. And like I said, if you go to the website, all of the outlines are on there. That you can kind of use to study some of the points on the outlines. If you're just kind of visiting with us, this is not so detailed. Sometimes the outlines could be 4 pages long, so we don't have an opportunity in every class period to hit every point. But I do have a lot of the backup scriptures associated with the points, so you can go back on your own and do some studying and kind of filling in some of the blanks there. But welcome. Thank you for being here this morning. The book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're going to do the second lesson. And we're going to take it out of Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and chapter 11. But on chapter 11 we're going to stop at verse 8 because I want to pick up the last couple of verses. I'm going to save those for something that we're going to do next week. So roughly chapter 10 and chapter 11. And it's the second in a series of lessons where we're listening to the preacher. And the preacher here is Solomon. And he's giving us wisdom to endure life's vanities. Okay? And if you've been with us throughout our study, all the way back with chapter 1, we talk about how life is full of vanities through Solomon's eyes and his rendition of life through the eyes of men living on this earth is not the best view of life, is it? Life is a struggle. Life is worthless per se. There's not a lot of good in this life, he says. But then as he develops his theme, remember, this is wisdom literature, a lot of general truths back to back to back. And as he develops his theme for the book, it's very quickly brought out to our attention that life and all in life is vain or vanity if you don't have God sitting in the middle of your heart, right? And so he spends chapter after chapter talking about how the non-Christian or the person who doesn't have a God-centered life is never going to be happy and he's always going to be disappointed. And we pretty much agree with that, don't we? I won't go into it too much, and I was thinking about, I may just save this for another series at another time. But Paul deals with this when he talks to the Thessalonians, when he writes the book to the Thessalonians letters. You remember they had a lot of concern about, hey, what about our brothers and sisters that have passed away before the second coming of Christ? You remember all the questions about that? What happens to them? And Paul goes into a big dissertation about, don't worry about them that are sleeping. You remember? We always kind of make a pause there and say, and when we're teaching children, we always have to say they're not sleeping per se. They're basically asleep in Christ. They're kind of like they've died, or they're died, but it's not a complete death. And sometimes when we teach that passage to our small kids, it can be hard for them to understand because of the terminology that's used. I digress to say, when Paul talks about Christ's death, he actually used the term dead. So there is a difference in the terminology there. And death, according to Paul, meaning death is what? Death is separation from a person from God. And eternal death is what? Eternal separation from man and God. Right? And so while we're talking about to bring us back, we won't develop that any further, but we can get into some of that at a later date. But Solomon is sitting here saying, if you allow yourself to die meaning separation from God, there is no good means to an end from this world. And that's why he keeps coming back and pounding and pounding and pounding. Here are ways to use wisdom to make sense out of this crazy world that we live in so that you can have hope when we die. And then when we have hope, and then you die as a person that has God centered in the middle of his life, then all of this stuff makes sense, because then we travel straight into the arms of God forever and ever and ever. But he knows that we're human beings, and he knows that we're shallow thinkers, and he knows that we're all into me in the here and the now. And so he's saying, I know that y'all are going to sit here and wonder, why is the world not making any sense? I can't figure this world out. And he's laughing at us in his book. And he comes, and we'll get to it, because he says, do you know why you can't figure it out? Because God hasn't given you the key to figure it out. His ways are not your ways. You don't understand what God's doing. You're not capable of understanding what God's doing. But you know what you are capable of? Is making the decision to follow in the footsteps of Christ, doing everything you can to stay close to God, and everything else will fall into place. But the readers, i.e. us, for some reason, we still want to know more. We want to make sense out of something that God tells us. You're just not able to be able to figure it out. So, with that kind of background, it wasn't last week's lesson, but the lesson before this, you remember Solomon spent a lot of time talking about there's a couple of things that are just, we're going to have to accept, because in this life we can't avoid. Number one is the inevitability of death. Okay? Remember we talked about that. Everybody here is going to die. Number two is, in your stay on this earth, you're going to have to endure bad governments run by men. Men, women, people. Right? You're going to have the inevitability of death, and you're going to have bad governments. And he's saying, get used to it. And you remember the chapters before, he says, what are you supposed to do about that? And he was very clear to say, be patient. That was the number one thing he said, was you have to be patient in dealing with bad governments. And why did he say that's the number one important thing? Because you remember when he talks to us about how the world works, it just goes in one big circle. What's here today is going to be gone tomorrow. And change is coming, whether you like it or not. Trust in God to take care of the government that he put in place. Do what's right. And everything will come back around. So, he gives us some more information in this lesson today. And he talks about using wisdom, right? God-given wisdom to endure the governments of men. And so, in chapters 10 and 11, he starts right off giving us this wisdom. And let's look at chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. I will say, if you've done some reading between chapter 10 and 11, he really is on a roller coaster here. He'll be talking about something, and then all of a sudden in the next verse, he's completely somewhere else. Okay? So, he is a little bit all over the board in his wisdom instruction to us, but let's just stay the course, keep reading through it. So, verses 1 through 3. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment, and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he's a fool. We've studied this. He's talked about folly before, hadn't he? 4 or 5 chapters ago. Folly is not a term that we use a lot every day. So let's back up and make sure we know what folly is. What does the word folly mean? I looked it up where you don't have to. I see a bunch of iPhones going right now. Oh, silliness. Yeah, it can be. Can be. Vain acts. Yeah. I looked it up. A lack of good sense or normal prudence and foresight. A foolish act or idea. Basically what? Making bad decisions for the wrong reason. Right? Sinful acts. Foolish acts. I like the term when it says not a normal prudence and foresight. So all of a sudden that kind of puts us into not a patient decision, but an impatient decision. Right? Not thought out. And you think about us as human beings, we can be full of this impatience. We can be full of making bad decisions. You know, bad decisions, they kind of stair-step over each other. We have a hard time getting out of our own way when we start making bad decisions sometimes, don't we? We make a bad decision, and then all of a sudden we make another bad decision because of the one before it, and next thing you know, we're just falling all the way down the stairs. Part of human nature. We have to really watch that. There also is a definition of this word folly that I found interesting. And have you ever heard of a folly house? Okay, what that is if you're driving on the road and you look up into the middle of this pasture, and right in the middle of this pasture you may see this really nice, interesting building. Maybe it looks like a European castle, or maybe it looks like something very ornate. And you go, man, that's pretty cool. I want to go look at that. So you stop and you walk up to it, and what do you find? There's nothing behind it. There's nothing inside of it. It's just basically something designed to look pretty from afar off. It's a real pretty building that's useless. That's the word folly. So what is the writer here? What does Solomon say about this folly? He basically says in verse 1, folly mars the finest of reputations. And I thought that was exactly right. How many times can we live our life doing everything we can to make good decisions, to be upstanding individuals? I'm at church on Sunday, I have my kids here, everything's going just right, and then for whatever reason we make a series of mistakes, and that reputation that I had has just really taken a hit or suffered, right? A self-inflicted gunshot wound to my reputation because of a series of bad decisions that I made. Think about that. Maybe you're a person that's never had a drink of alcohol in your entire life, and you're 55 or 60 years old. And you decide to have that one, and that one you get behind a car, and all of a sudden you get arrested for a DWI. What do people think about you? A career drunk. That's just an example. You can't ever get your reputation. Well, it's hard to get your reputation back when you don't use godly wisdom in your decision making. And that's what Solomon's telling us here. Guard yourself and be careful with your decision making because there's consequences to it. Okay? Yes?
when we make those bad decisions, and there are consequences even when you're forgiven of those. I think a lot of people think that there are no consequences when you ask for forgiveness and you are forgiven, but there are. Whether you're forgiven or not, there's always going to be consequences of your decision.
Yeah, that's a good point. God forgets your sins for those that are walking in the light as He is in the light, right? He doesn't even remember them. But that doesn't mean there's not consequences for the sins that you have. It's human nature, right? Don't ask me to forgive somebody. Do what?
We're first to judge.
Oh yeah, we judge real quick, real hard too. Don't ever ask me to forgive anybody. That person made me mad. Right? We've got to get over that. If you move past on a couple of verses down to number, well, let's just say number 4, chapter 10, verse 4. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. You see, folly will invariably betray its own stupidity. Right? Bad step over bad step. Bad decision over bad step. It will come up. In contrast, the wise person will be patient, steadfast, conciliatory, even when opposed by those in authority. Who does that? The wise man, Solomon says. The person who is allowing God to guide his decision making. So if you take the opposite of that, the person who's not, the person that we're discussing here, life is vain, life is worthless, woe is me, that person is not patient. That person is not steadfast. He's flighty. He's not going to stick to something long. He's not conciliatory. He's aggressive. He's combative. We don't want to be people like that, do we? And what Solomon's kind of saying is those traits for that worldly person will eventually, you will wake up and say, this is a terrible life that I have. We will end up listening to ourselves if we talk to ourselves long enough. You ever thought about that? You try to do good and are determined to do good, and you talk yourself into doing good, you're eventually going to do good. But if you take the other way around and everything is woe is me, and I can't believe he or she did that, and so said this about me, and I can't stand it, it's going to follow you. We will listen to ourselves over time. Be positive. Folly also manifests itself in government. Look at verses 5 through 7. And for lack of time, I won't read it, the scriptures here out of the Bible. I'll give you a little summary. Folly often manifests itself in government. He's talked about this before. He's bringing it back into our attention again. And he says it's an evil observed by the preacher. He's seen this. Solomon has seen it in his day and time about how folly, it interacts with government and causes bad things to happen. And he refers to it as evil things have happened. What are those things? He says that there's errors that happen in government. People make mistakes. Why do people make mistakes? Because of their folly? Because of their sinful nature. They want to party all the time and spend money that they don't have. We think that's just something the United States government does. It's happening here in Solomon's time. Look what he says. He says, folly's exalted while the rich are debased. Bad decisions increase when the rich or the rulers are wicked, sinful, corrupt, immoral. Right? He's saying it's happening here. It's going to happen in your time. He says he's seen servants in power while true princes are humbled. What does that mean? Servants in power and true princes are humbled? Because guess what happened when you have graft and corruption in government? The people who are most qualified don't always get to the top, do they? We say it in our terms as, well, he got a brother-in-law deal. Right? It's happening in Solomon's time too. He's saying he's sitting there looking at it. Those who labor with foolishness hurt and hinder themselves. And he gives a lot of examples in verses 8 and 10. He says, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. He's basically saying those who labor in foolishness can hurt themselves. Right? If we don't have God in the center of our life, in everything we do, we are bound and determined to make bad decisions. That's what he's saying. Because where do good decisions come from? God guiding our hearts and thoughts and actions. But as soon as we don't have God guiding our hearts, thoughts, and actions, who's guiding it? Us. And do you think we're capable of doing this, living in a godly way in this world, in this time, apart from God? It's impossible. And that's what the writer is saying here. The foolish seldom know how to restrain themselves in verses 11 through 15. Well, that's a truth, isn't it? The foolish do not even know how to restrain themselves. They do not know how to hold their tongues. They don't know how to direct their labor. The tongue thing, we really want to skip over that, don't we? The foolish person doesn't know how to hold his tongue. Isn't that the truth, though? Look at verses 16 to 19. Like I said, some of this is kind of hard reading because he is floating around. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. What's he saying there? Talking about government. Talking about leadership. Woe to the land whose rulers slip into bad decisions for personal pride. Because what happens? When leaders of a country start thinking about themselves and not the people, what happens? It says right here, infrastructure gets delayed. There's a laziness that comes upon the government because, it's all about me. It's not all about you. And the next thing you know, you have the people who are suffering because of it. Okay? And then he comes right around on the other side and he says, hey, good or woe for the land, for the prince who delays and feasts at the right time for the right reason, and then the land is blessed, right? So what's that mean to us? It's real interesting because he says when you start living life for you and only you, bad things are headed your way. When you live your life to be a shining star to affect other people, with God in the middle of it, then good things are headed your way. That's what this verses are talking about. Are you going to be about me and only me, or are you going to be about helping other people? We struggle with that a little bit. And then I like in verse 20, and we're going to come back to that here in just a second. And I like in verse 20, do not curse the king, even in your thoughts. Do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. Now listen to this. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. Okay, what does he mean there? He says, don't talk about other people because they're going to find out. That's what he says. Don't talk about other folks because they're going to confront you about it. Because guess what? Nobody keeps a secret. We're bad about this, aren't we? We've got to be better than this. And that's what Solomon's saying. Right. Yeah. The thing is, with social media now, you can even just say it on a keyboard in the middle of your room and with nobody hearing it, and it's going to come back around to you. But this is what Solomon's saying. He's saying, don't spend your time being a negative person, talking bad about people, because that's not going about God's business. And we need to be people that are God-centered. We need to be people that are all about helping others and saying good things about lifting people up. And if we go about doing that, then this life all of a sudden becomes fun and not vain. Life all of a sudden is worth living instead of just a drag. What did he start chapter 10 by saying? One slip up causes your reputation to take a bad hit. And Aaron's right. 95% of the time, we are building people up. But then all of a sudden, we, for whatever reason, say or do this one thing. And now guess what? We're labeled as a gossip. Everybody thinks that we're, we don't love people. We're just here to be divisive. We just like talking about him or her. And he just finished saying, don't do that because your reputation takes a serious hit on that. And we as Christians can't afford that. So if we move to chapter 11, verse 19, a feast is made for laughter and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. I read that, and I don't know. Some of these, I'll be honest with you, that's why I'm telling you, some of this is some pretty tough reading. I have a thought.
You think he's saying with money you can take care of some of the harsh things in life that are against you?
Well, let's go back and say, what has he said about money so far, right? I think it was chapter 5. He went back and he's talking about money can do a lot of things for you, right? And money can also do a lot of things to hurt you. What money can do is it allows you to have access to certain people to help you with certain things, right? Where money becomes a problem is if the money gets in the way of living your life for God, right? Because what happens when people, well, I can't say that definitely. Sometimes when people get a lot of money, what happens? They start looking at me, myself, and I instead of God first. They start using the money for wrong things, for personal gain and greed, instead of using money to help people. They lose their benevolence factor of it. And so when he's sitting here in the middle of verse 18, he's talking about how he spends a lot of time talking about how folly manifests itself in the government. And then he says, because of laziness of the buildings decays, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. Talking about folly is causing the rulers to only be concerned with them, not the people. Then he says, a feast is made for laughter, okay? Wasting money, right? A feast is made for laughter and just folly instead of a feast being made to come up with a plan for benevolence. And wine makes merry, so there's obviously drinking going on. This sounds like an old-fashioned party. But money answers everything, right? I can throw money at it and win. Yes, sir.
To me, what I get from that is he's saying money can give you the illusion of happiness.
Yeah. Yeah, I can pay for anything with money.
Yeah, but it may not be happiness.
That's right.
Wasn't there some court case about affluenza?
Yeah. Right. Right. Good comments from everybody. I will say that talking about it being temporary, with what Aaron was talking about, everything here is temporary, it's not permanent. Starting with chapter 11, Solomon here changes to talk about our benevolent behavior. Okay? And that's what these first 8 verses, he's sitting here talking about, hey, look, this isn't about you. What this is about is you helping people. We are in the people helping business. And he transfers right into that. So let's look here real quickly at verse 11 and let me just kind of paraphrase it a little bit. I'll read 1 and 2. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. Basically, he's saying, do good and encourage kindness and hospitality to everybody because you don't know what's in store for you. Right? And you say, well, okay, let me kind of connect those dots. He's going to go in to say, you can't control the wind, you can't control, and then he goes in to talk about how a baby is formed in the womb. You can't control that. You don't even know how that happens because that's God's work. You can't control the wind, and you don't know how the wind, the energy that makes the winds blow, and you don't know that because that's God's work. So there's a lot of things that happen in this life that you don't understand and you'll never understand. And so, to bring it around, there's also bad things headed your way. That's what the first 8 verses of chapter 11 talk about. Unfortunately, because of this world we live in, there's bad things headed your way. Some of it is self-inflicted because of the folly that you've decided to engage in, and some of it is just going to happen because there's things set in motion. So what does he say? Do good to everybody. Do good. Help people. Because you never know when you just may need help yourself. We also say, give till it hurts and give a little more. Right? Why is he saying do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Number one, because he did it for us. He gave to the point that he let Jesus leave his presence to come down here, which was tough. And then he gave till it hurt when he gave his life for us. Be like me, he says. And it's just the nature of human beings. If you're a person that's all about helping other people get what they want, do you know what's going to happen to you? You're going to get what you want. Now, that's not why we do it, but it's what happens. When we become people that are absolutely committed to being full of benevolence and helping people, God will reward us as a church. He talks real quick in verses 3 and 4 about rain and storms are coming and you can't do anything about it. Trees are going to fall wherever they want to fall. You can't do anything about it. And one of these days, if you sit around and don't do anything, and you just sit around and never help anybody, then what happens when you need help? There's going to be nobody around. Okay? That's what he's talking about there. Now let's look in the last minute, let's look at the conclusion, because I think these conclusions are really good. We may not be able to escape the days of darkness in this life. Evil days often brought on by the governments of men, and I call that self-inflicted, right? Sometimes we have self-inflicted pain because of our folly. And there's also evil days that occur which we have no explanation. That's just God has set some things in motion. So some we can control, some we can't. But thanks to the preacher, we know how best to endure life's vanities. And here's the two takeaways from chapter 10 and chapter 11. If we don't hear anything else, hear this. Avoid making things worse through our own folly. Right? We don't need self-inflicted problems. Number 2, sow the seeds of benevolence that can help us later when the days are evil. Don't hurt yourself by getting engaged with stuff that doesn't help you. And sow the seed of benevolence because it makes you a better person. That's really chapter 10 and chapter 11. And then there's a couple of more points down there, but it is easy for us to write a check these days. A lot of times it's more rewarding if we give of ourselves. Okay, well, thank y'all for coming. I've kept you about a minute too long. Thank you for being here, and we'll go lesson number 10 next week.